Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome back again to Classic Horror and Other Stories. This is Volume 2. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Do us a big favor. Leave us a message in the comments letting us know what stories you would like to hear in an upcoming installment. Alright, with that, here we go. Lamb to the Slaughter by Roald, Dahl. The room was warm and clean, the curtains drawn, the 2 table lamps alight, hers and the one by the empty chair opposite. On the sideboard behind her, 2 tall glasses, soda water, whiskey, fresh ice cubes in a thermos bucket. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again she would glance up at the clock, but without anxiety, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone by made it nearer the time when he would come home. There was a slow, smiling air about her, and about everything she did. The drop of a head as she bent over her sewing was curiously tranquil. Her skin, for this was her 6th month with child, had acquired a wonderful, translucent quality. The mouth was soft, and the eyes, with their new, placid look, seemed larger, darker than before. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen, and a few moments later, punctually as always, she heard the tires on the gravel outside, and the car door slamming, the footsteps passing the window, the key turning in the lock. She laid aside her sewing, stood up, and went forward to kiss him as he came in. "Hello, darling," she said. "Hello, darling," he answered. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks. A strongish one for him, a weak one for herself. And soon she was back again in her chair with the sewing, and he in the other opposite, holding the tall glass with both hands, rocking it so the ice cubes tinkled against the side. For her, this was always a blissful time of day. She knew he didn't want to speak much until the first drink was finished, and she, on the other side, was content to sit quietly, enjoying his company after the long hours alone in the house. She loved to luxuriate in the presence of this man, and to feel, almost as a sunbather feels the sun, that warm male glow that came out of him to her when they were alone together. She loved him for the way he sat loosely in a chair, for the way he came in a door or moved slowly across the room with long strides. She loved intent, far look in his eyes when they rested in her, the funny shape of his mouth, and especially the way he remained silent about his tiredness, sitting still with himself until the whiskey had taken some of it away. "Tired, darling?" "Yes," he said. "I'm tired." And as he spoke, he did an unusual thing. He lifted his glass and drained it in one swallow, although there was still at least half of it left. She wasn't really watching him, but she knew what had to be done because she heard the ice cubes falling back against the bottom of the empty glass when he lowered his arm. He paused a moment, leaning forward in the chair. Then he got up and went slowly over to fetch himself another. "I'll get it," she cried, jumping up. "Sit down," he said. When he came back, she noticed that the new drink was dark amber with the quantity of whiskey in it. "Darling, shall I get your slippers?" "No." She watched him as he began to sip the dark yellow drink, and she could see little oily swirls in the liquid because it was so strong. "I think it's a shame," she said, "that when a policeman gets to be as senior as you, they keep him walking about on his feet all day long." He didn't answer, so she bent her head again and went on with her sewing. But each time he lifted the drink to his lips, she heard the ice cubes clinking against the side of the glass. "Darling," she said, "would you like me to get you some cheese? I haven't made any supper because it's Thursday." "No," he said. "If you're too tired to eat out," she went on, "it's still not too late. There's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer, and you can have it right here and not even move out of the chair." Her eyes waited on him for an answer, a smile, a little nod, but he made no sign. "Anyway," she went on, "I'll get you some cheese and crackers first." "I don't want it," he said. She moved uneasily in her chair, the large eyes still watching his face. "But you must eat. I'll fix it anyway, and then you can have it or not, as you like." She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. "Sit down," he said. "Just for a minute, sit down." It wasn't till then that she began to get frightened. "Go on," he said. "Sit down." She lowered herself back slowly into the chair, watching him all the time with those large, bewildered eyes. He had finished the second drink and was staring down into the glass, frowning. "Listen," he said. "I've got something to tell you." "What is it, darling? What's the matter?" He had now become absolutely motionless, and he kept his head down so that the light from the lamp beside him fell across the upper part of his face, leaving the chin and mouth in shadow. She noticed there was a little muscle moving near the corner of his left eye. "This is going to be a bit of a shock to you, I'm afraid," he said. "But I've thought about it a good deal, and I've decided the only thing to do is to tell you right away. I hope you won't blame me too much." And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at most, and she sat very still through it all, watching him with a kind of dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. "So there it is," he added. "And I know it's kind of a bad time to be telling you, but there simply wasn't any other way. Of course, I'll give you money and see that you're looked after. But there needn't really be any fuss. I hope not, anyway. It wouldn't be very good for my job." Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself had imagined the whole thing. Maybe if she went about her business and acted as though she hadn't been listening, then later, when she sort of woke up again, she might find none of it had ever happened. "I'll get the supper," she managed to whisper, and this time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all, except a slight nausea and a desire to vomit. Everything was automatic now. Down the steps to the cellar, the light switch, the deep freeze, the hand inside the cabinet taking hold of the first object it met. She lifted it out and looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right then, they would have lamb for supper. She carried it upstairs, holding the thin bone end of it with both her hands, and as she went through the living room, she saw him standing over by the window with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake," he said, hearing her but not turning around. Don't make supper for me. I'm going out. At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big, frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She might just as well have hit him with a steel club. She stepped back a pace, waiting, and the funny thing was that he remained standing there for at least 4 or 5 seconds, gently swaying. Then he crashed to the carpet. The violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning, helped bring her out of the shock. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, and she stood for a while, blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. "All right," she told herself, "so I've killed him." It was extraordinary now how clear her mind became all of a sudden. She began thinking very fast. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be. That was fine. It made no difference to her. In fact, it would be a relief. On the other hand, what about the child? What were the laws about murderers with unborn children? Did they kill them both, mother and child? Or did they wait until the 10th month? What did they do? Mary Maloney didn't know, and she certainly wasn't prepared to take a chance. She carried the meat into the kitchen, placed it in a pan, turned the oven on high, and shoved it inside. Then she washed her hands and ran upstairs to the bedroom. She sat down before the mirror, tidied her hair, touched up her lopsided face. She tried a smile. It came out rather peculiar. She tried again. "Hello, Sam," she said brightly, aloud. The voice sounded peculiar, too. "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, I think a can of peas." That was better. Both the smile and the voice were coming out better now. She rehearsed it several times more. Then she ran downstairs, took her coat, went out the back door, down the garden, and into the street. It wasn't 6 o'clock yet, and the lights were still on in the grocery shop. "Hello, Sam," she said brightly, smiling at the man behind the counter. "Why, good evening, Miss Maloney. How are you?" "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas." The man turned and reached up behind him on the shelf for the peas. "Patrick's decided he's tired and doesn't want to eat out tonight," she told him. "We usually go out Thursdays, you know, and now he's caught me without any vegetables in the house." "Then how about meat, Miss Maloney?" "No, I've got meat, thanks. I've got a nice leg of lamb from the freezer." "Oh!" "I don't much like cooking it frozen, Sam, but I'm taking a chance on it this time. You think it'll be all right?" "Personally," the grocer said, "I don't believe it makes any difference. You want these Idaho potatoes?" "Oh, yes, that'll be fine. 2 of those." "Anything else?" The grocer cocked his head on one side, looking at her pleasantly. "How about afterwards? What are you going to give him for afterwards?" "Well, what would you suggest, Sam?" The man glanced around his shop. "How about a nice big slice of cheesecake? I know he likes that." "Perfect," she said. "He loves it." And when it was all wrapped and she had paid, she put on her brightest smile and said, "Thank you, Sam. Good night." "Good night, Miss Maloney, and thank you." And now, she told herself as she hurried back, all she was doing now, She was returning home to her husband, and he was waiting for his supper. And she must cook it good and make it as tasty as possible, because the poor man was tired, and if, when she entered the house, she happened to find anything unusual or tragic or terrible, then naturally it would be a shock, and she'd become frantic with grief and horror. Mind you, she wasn't expecting to find anything. She was just going home with the vegetables. Mrs. Patrick Maloney going home with the vegetables on Thursday evening to cook supper for her husband. That's the way, she told herself. Do everything right and natural. Keep things absolutely natural, and there will be no need for any acting at all. Therefore, when she entered the kitchen by the back door, she was humming a little tune to herself and smiling. "Patrick," she called. "How are you, darling?" She put the parcel down on the table and went through into the living room. And when she saw him lying there on the floor with his legs doubled up and one arm twisted underneath his body, it really was rather a shock. All the old love and longing for him welled up inside her, and she ran over to him, knelt down beside him, and began to cry her heart out. It was easy. No acting was necessary. A few minutes later, she got up and went to the phone. She knew the number of the police station, and when the man at the other end answered, she cried to him, "Quick! Come quick! Patrick's dead!"
"Who's speaking?"
"Mrs. Maloney! Mrs. Patrick Maloney!"
"You mean Patrick Maloney's dead?"
"I think so," she sobbed. "He's lying on the floor, and I think he's dead."
"Be right over,"
the man said. The car came very quickly, and when she opened the front door, 2 policemen walked in. She knew them both. She knew nearly all the men at that precinct, and she fell right into a chair, then went over to join the other one, who was called O'Malley, kneeling by the body. "Is he dead?" she cried.
"I'm afraid he is. What happened?"
Briefly, she told her story about going to the grocer and coming back to find him on the floor. While she was talking, crying and talking, Noonan discovered a small patch of congealed blood on the dead man's head. He showed it to O'Malley, who got up at once and hurried to the phone. Soon, other men began to come into the house. First, a doctor, then 2 detectives, one of whom she knew by name. Later, a police photographer arrived and took pictures, and a man who knew about fingerprints. There was a great deal of whispering and muttering beside the corpse, and detectives kept asking her a lot of questions, but they always treated her kindly. She told her story again, this time right from the beginning, when Patrick had come in, and she was sewing, and he was tired, so tired he hadn't wanted to go out for supper. She told how she put the meat in the oven. "It's there now, cooking," and how she'd slopped out to the grocer for vegetables and come back to find him lying on the floor.
"Which grocer?"
one of the detectives asked. She told him, and he turned and whispered something to the other detective, who immediately went outside into the street. In 15 minutes, he was back with a page of notes, and there was more whispering. And through her sobbing, she heard a few of the whispered phrases. "Acted quite normal, very cheerful, wanted to give him a good supper, peas, cheesecake, impossible that she..." After a while, the photographer and the doctor departed, and 2 other men came in and took the corpse away on a stretcher. Then the fingerprint man went away. The 2 detectives remained, and so did the 2 policemen. They were exceptionally nice to her, and Jack Noonan asked if she wouldn't rather go somewhere else, to her sister's house perhaps, or to his own wife, who would take care of her and put her up for the night. No, she said. She didn't feel she could move even a yard at the moment. Would they mind awfully if she stayed just where she was until she felt better? She didn't feel too good at the moment. She really didn't.
Then hadn't she better lie down on the bed?
Jack Noonan asked. No, she said. She'd like to stay right where she was, in this chair. A little later, perhaps, when she felt better, she would move. So they left her there while they went about their business, searching the house. Occasionally, one of the detectives asked her another question. Sometimes Jack Noonan spoke at her gently as he passed by. Her husband, he told her, had been killed by a blow on the back of the head administered with a heavy, blunt instrument, almost certainly a large piece of metal. They were looking for the weapon. The murderer may have taken it with him, but on the other hand, he may have thrown it away or hidden it somewhere on the premises.
It's the old story, he said. Get the weapon, and you've got the man.
Later, one of the detectives came up and sat beside her. Did she know, he asked, of anything in the house that could have been used as a weapon? Would she mind having a look around to see if anything was missing? A very big spanner, for example, or a heavy metal vase. They didn't have any heavy metal vases, she said. Or a big spanner? She didn't think they had a big spanner, but there might be some things like that in the garage. The search went on. She knew that there were other policemen in the garden all around the house. She could hear their footsteps on the gravel outside, and sometimes she saw a flash of a torch through a chink in the curtains. It began to get late, nearly 9, she noticed by the clock on the mantel. The 4 men searching the room seemed to be growing weary, a trifle exasperated. "Jack," she said the next time Sergeant Noonan went by, "would you mind giving me a drink?"
Sure, I'll give you a drink. You mean this whiskey?
Yes, please, but just a small one. It might make me feel better. He handed her the glass. "Why don't you have one yourself?" she said. "You must be awfully tired. Please do. You've been very good to me."
Well, he answered, it's not strictly allowed, but I might take just a drop to keep me going.
One by one, the others came in and were persuaded to take a little nip of whiskey. They stood around rather awkwardly with the drinks in their hands, uncomfortable in her presence, trying to say consoling things to her. Sergeant Noonan wandered into the kitchen, come out quickly, and said,
"Look, Mrs. Maloney, you know that oven of yours is still on, and the meat's still inside."
"Oh, dear me!" she cried. "So it is."
I better turn it off for you, hadn't I?
"Will you do that, Jack? Thank you so much." When the sergeant returned the second time, she looked at him with her large, dark, tearful eyes. "Jack Noonan," she said.
"Yes?"
"Would you do me a small favor, you and these others?"
"We can try, Mrs. Maloney."
"Well," she said, "here you all are, and good friends of dear Patrick's too, and helping to catch the man who killed him. You must be terribly hungry by now, because it's long past your supper time, and I know Patrick would never forgive me, God bless his soul, if I allowed you to remain in his house without offering you decent hospitality. Why don't you eat up that lamb that's in the oven? It'll be cooked just right by now."
"Oh, wouldn't dream of it,"
Sergeant Noonan said.
Please, she begged. Please eat it. Personally, I couldn't touch a thing. Certainly not what's been in the house when he was here. But it's all right for you. It'd be a favor to me if you'd eat it up. Then you can go on with your work again afterwards.
There was a good deal of hesitating among the 4 policemen, but they were clearly hungry, and in the end they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. The woman stayed where she was, listening to them speaking among themselves, their voices thick and sloppy because their mouths were full of meat.
Have some more, Charlie. No, better not finish it.
She wants us to finish it. She said, though, be doing her a favor.
Okay, then give me some more.
That's a hell of a big club that guy must have used to hit poor Patrick, one of them was saying. The doc says his skull was smashed all to pieces, just like from a sledgehammer.
Well, that's why it ought to be easy to find.
Exactly what I say.
Whoever done it, they're not going to be carrying a thing like that around with them longer than they need.
One of them belched.
Personally, I think it's right here on the premises.
Probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack? And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle. The Pearl of Love by H.G. Wells. The pearl is lovelier than the most brilliant of crystalline stones, the moralist declares, because it is made through the suffering of a living creature. About that I can say nothing, because I feel none of the fascination of pearls. Their cloudy luster moves me not at all, nor can I decide for myself upon that age-long dispute whether the pearl of love is the cruelest of stories or only a gracious fable of the immortality of beauty. Both the story and the controversy will be familiar to students of medieval Persian prose. The story is a short one, though the commentary upon it is a respectable part of the literature of that period. They have treated it as a poetic invention, and they have treated it as an allegory, meaning this, that, or the other thing. Theologians have had their copious way with it, dealing with it particularly as concerning the restoration of the body after death, and it has been greatly used as a parable by those who write about aesthetics, and many have held it to be a statement of a fact, simple and baldly true. The story is laid in North India, which is the most fruitful soil for sublime love stories of all the lands in the world. It was in a country of sunshine and lakes, and rich forests and hills and fertile valleys, and far away the great mountains hung in the sky. Peaks, crests, ridges of inaccessible and eternal snow. There was a young prince, lord of all of the land, and he found a maiden of indescribable beauty and delightfulness, and he made her his queen, and laid his heart at her feet. Love was theirs, full of joys and sweetness, full of hope, exquisite, brave, and marvelous love, beyond anything you have ever dreamt of love. It was theirs for a year and a part of a year, and then suddenly, because of some venomous sting that came to her in a thicket, she died, and for a while the prince was utterly prostrated. He was silent and motionless with grief. They feared he might kill himself, and he had neither sons nor brothers to succeed him. For 2 days and nights he lay upon his face, fasting, across the foot of a couch which bore her calm and lovely body. Then he arose and ate, and went about very quietly, like one who has taken a great resolution. He caused her body to be put in a coffin of lead mixed with silver, and for that he had an outer coffin made of the most precious and scented woods wrought with gold, and about that there was to be a sarcophagus of alabaster, inlaid with precious stones. And while these things were being done, he spent his time, for the most part, by the pools, and in the garden houses, and pavilions, and groves, and in those chambers in the palace where they two had been most together, brooding upon her loveliness. He did not rend his garments, nor defile himself with ashes and sackcloth, as the custom was, for his love was too great for such extravagances. At last he came forth again among his counselors and before the people, and told them what he had a mind to do. He said he could never more touch women. He could never more think of them, and so he would find a seemly youth to adopt for his heir, and train him to his task, and that he would do his princely duties as became him, but that for the rest of it he would give himself with all his power, and all his strength, and all his wealth, all that he could command, to make a monument worthy of his incomparable, dear, lost mistress. A building it should be of perfect grace and beauty, more marvelous than any other building had ever been or could ever be, so that to the end of time it should be a wonder, and men would treasure it, and speak of it, and desire to see it, and come from all lands of the earth to visit and recall the name and memory of his queen. And this building, he said, was to be called the Pearl of Love. And this his counselors and people permitted him to do, and so he did. Year followed year, and all the years he devoted himself to building and adorning the Pearl of Love. A great foundation was hewn out of the living rock in a place whence one seemed to be looking at the snowy wilderness of the great mountains across the valley of the world. Villages and hills there were, a winding river, and very far away 3 great cities. Here they put the sarcophagus of alabaster beneath a pavilion of cunning workmanship, and about it there were set pillars of strange and lovely stone, and wrought and fretted walls, and a great casket of masonry bearing a dome and pinnacles and cupolas as exquisite as a jewel. At first, the design of Pearl of Love was less bold and subtle than it became later. At first, it was smaller and more wrought and encrusted. There were many pierced screens and delicate clusters of rosy-hued pillars, and the sarcophagus lay like a child that sleeps among flowers. The first dome was covered with green tiles, framed and held together by silver, but this was taken away again because it seemed close, but did not soar grandly enough for the broadening imagination of the prince. For by this time he was no longer the graceful youth who had loved the girl queen. He was now a man, grave and intent, wholly set upon the building of the Pearl of Love. With every year of effort, he had learnt new possibilities in arch and wall and buttress. He had acquired greater power over the material he had to use, and he had learnt of 100 stones and hues and effects that he could have never thought of in the beginning. His sense of color had grown finer and colder. He cared no more for the enameled gold-lined brightness that had pleased him first, the brightness of an illuminated missile. He thought now for blue coloring like the sky, and for the subtle hues of great distances, for recondite shadows and sudden broad floods of purple opalescence, and for grandeur in space. He wearied altogether of carvings and pictures and inlaid ornamentation and all the little careful work of men. "Those were pretty things," he said of his earlier decorations, and had them put aside in subordinate buildings where they would not hamper his main design. Greater and greater grew his artistry. With awe and amazement, people saw the Pearl of Love sweeping up from its first beginnings to a superhuman breadth and height of magnificence. They did not know clearly what they had expected, but never had they expected so sublime a thing as this. "Wonderful are the miracles," they whispered, "that love can do." And all the women in the world, whatever other loves they had, loved the prince for the splendor of his devotion. Through the middle of the building ran a great aisle, a vista, that the prince came to care for more and more. From the inner entrance of the building, he looked along the length of an immense pillared gallery and across the central area from which the rose-hued columns had long since vanished, over the top of the pavilion under which lay the sarcophagus, through a marvelously designed opening to the snowy wilderness of the great mountain, the lord of all mountains, 200 miles away. The pillars and arches and buttresses and galleries soared and floated on either side, perfect yet unobtrusive, like great archangels waiting in the shadows about the presence of God. When men saw that austere beauty for the first time, they were exalted, and then they shivered and their hearts bowed down. Very often would the prince come to stand there and look at that vista, deeply moved and not yet fully satisfied. The Pearl of Love had still something for him to do, he felt, before his task was done. Always he would order some little alteration to be made, or some recent alteration to be put back again. And one day he said that the sarcophagus would be clearer and simpler without the pavilion, and after regarding it very steadfastly for a long time, he had the pavilion dismantled and removed. The next day he came and said nothing, and the next day, and the next. Then, for 2 days he stayed away altogether. Then he returned, bringing with him an architect and 2 master craftsmen and a small retinue. All looked, standing together silently in a little group, amidst the serene vastness of their achievement. No trace of toil remained in its perfection. It was as if God of nature's beauty had taken over their offspring to himself. Only one thing there was to mar the absolute harmony. There was a certain disproportion about the sarcophagus. It had never been enlarged, and indeed, how could it have been enlarged since the early days? It challenged the eye. It nicked the streaming lines. In that sarcophagus was the casket of lead and silver, and in the casket of lead and silver was the queen, the dear, immortal cause of all this beauty. But now that sarcophagus seemed no more than a little dark oblong that lay incongruously in the great vista of the Pearl of Love. It was as if someone had dropped a small valice upon the crystal sea of heaven. Long the prince mused, but no one knew the thoughts that passed through his mind. At last he spoke. He pointed. "Take that thing away," he said. The Ninth Skeleton by Clark Ashton Smith. It was beneath the immaculate blue of a morning in April that I set out to keep my appointment with Guinevere. We had agreed to meet on Boulder Ridge at a spot well known to both of us. A small and circular field surrounded with pines and full of large stones, midway between her parents' home at Newcastle and my cabin on the northeastern extremity of the ridge near Auburn. Guinevere is my fiancée. It must be explained that at the time of which I write, there was a certain amount of opposition on the part of her parents to the engagement, an opposition since happily withdrawn. In fact, they had gone so far as to forbid me to call, and Guinevere and I could see each other only by stealth and infrequently. The ridge is a long and rambling moraine, heavily strewn in places with boulders, as its name implies, and with many outcroppings of black volcanic stone. Fruit ranches cling to some of its slopes, but scarcely any of the top is under cultivation, and much of the soil, indeed, is too thin and stony to be arable. With its twisted pines, often as fantastic in form as the cypresses of the California coast, and its gnarled and stunted oaks, the landscape has a wild and quaint beauty, with more than a hint of the Japanesque in places. It is perhaps 2 miles from my cabin to the place where I was to meet Guinevere. Since I was born in the very shadow of Boulder Ridge, and had lived upon or near it for most of my 30-odd years, I am familiar with every rod of its lovely and rugged extent, and, previous to that April morning, would scarcely have refrained from laughing if anyone had told me I could possibly lose my way. Since then, well, I assure you, I should not feel inclined to laugh. Truly it was a morning made for the trysts of lovers. Wild bees were humming busily in the patches of clover and in the ceanothus bushes with their great masses of white flowers, whose strange and heavy perfume intoxicated the air. Most of the spring blossoms were abroad. Cyclamen, yellow violet, poppy, wild hyacinth, and woodland star, and the green of the fields was opalescent with their coloring. Between the emerald of the buckeyes, the gray-green of the pines, the golden and dark and bluish greens of the oaks, I caught glimpses of the snow-white Sierras to the east and the faint blue of the coastal range to the west, beyond the pale and lilac levels of the Sacramento Valley. Following a vague trail, I went onwards across open fields where I had to thread my way among clustering boulders. My thoughts were all of Guinevere, and I looked only with a casual and desultory eye at the picturesqueness and vernal beauty that environed my path. I was halfway between my cabin and the meeting place when I became suddenly aware that the sunlight had darkened, and glanced up, thinking, of course, that an April cloud, appearing unobserved from beyond the horizon, had passed across the sun. Imagine then my surprise when I saw that the azure of the entire sky had turned to a dun and sinister brown, in the midst of which the sun was clearly visible, burning like an enormous round red ember. Then something strange and unfamiliar in the nature of my surroundings, which I was momentarily at a loss to define, forced itself upon my attention, and my surprise became a growing consternation. I stopped and looked about me, and realized, incredible as it seemed, that I had lost my way. For the pines on either hand were not those that I had expected to see. They were more gigantic, more gnarled than the ones I remembered, and their roots writhed in wilder and more serpentine contortions from a soil that was strangely loweredless, and where even the grass grew only in scanty tufts. There were boulders large as druidic monoliths, and the forms of some of them were such as one might see in a nightmare. Thinking, of course, that it all must be a dream, but with the sense of utter bewilderment which seldom, if ever, attends the absurdities of monstrosities of nightmare, I sought in vain to orient myself and to find some familiar landmark in the bizarre scene that lay before me. A path, broader than the one I had been following, but running in what I judged to be the same direction, wound on among the trees. It was covered with a gray dust, which, as I went forward, became deeper and displayed footprints of a singular form. Footprints that were surely too attenuate, too fantastically slender to be human, despite their 5 toe marks. Something about them, I know not what, something in the nature of their very thinness and elongation made me shiver. Afterwards, I wondered why I had not recognized them for what they were, but at the time, no suspicion entered my mind, only a vague sense of disquietude and indefinable trepidation. As I proceeded, the pines amid which I passed became momentarily more fantastic and more sinister in the contortions of their boughs and boles and roots. Some were like leering hags, others were obscenely crouching gargoyles, some appeared to ride in an eternity of hellish torture, others were convulsed as with a satanic merriment. All the while, the sky continued to darken slowly, the dun and dismal brown that I had first perceived turning through almost imperceptible changes of a tone to a dead, funereal purple, wherein the sun smoldered like a moon that had risen from a bath of blood. The trees and the whole landscape were saturated with this macabre purple, were immersed and steeped in its unnatural gloom. Only the rocks, as I went on, grew strangely paler, and their forms were somehow suggestive of headstones, of tombs and monuments. Beside the trail, there was no longer the green of vernal grass, only an earth mottled by drying algae and tiny lichens the color of verdigris. Also, there were patches of evil-looking fungi with stems of a leprous pallor and blackish heads that drooped and nodded loathsomely. The sky had now grown so dark that the whole scene took on a semi-nocturnal aspect and made me think of a doomed world in the twilight of a dying sun. All was airless and silent. There were no birds, no insects, no sighing of the pines, no lisping of leaves. A baleful and preternatural silence, like the silence of the infinite void. The trees became denser, then dwindled, and I came to a circular field. Here, there was no mistaking the nature of the monolithical boulders. They were headstones and funeral monuments, but so enormously ancient that the letterings or figures upon them were well nigh effaced, and the few characters that I could distinguish were not of any known language. About them there the hoariness and mystery and terror of incomputable eld. It was hard to believe that life and death could be as old as they. The trees around them were inconceivably gnarled and bowed, as with an almost equal burden of years. The sense of awful antiquity that these stones and pines all served to convey increased the oppression of my bewilderment, confirmed my disquietude. Nor was I reassured when I noticed on the soft earth about the headstones a number of those attenuate footprints of which I have already spoken. They were disposed in a fashion that was truly singular, seeming to depart from and return to the vicinity of each stone. Now, for the first time, I heard a sound other than the sound of my own footfalls in the silence of this macabre scene. Behind me, among the trees, there was a faint and evil rattling. I turned and listened. There was something in these sounds that served to complete the demoralization of my unstrung nerves, and monstrous fears, abominable fancies, trooped like the horde of a witch's sabbath through my brain. The reality that I was now to confront was no less monstrous. There was a whitish glimmering in the shadow of the trees, and a human skeleton bearing in its arms the skeleton of an infant emerged and came towards me. Intent as on some ulterior cryptic purpose, some charnel errand not to be surmised by the living, it went by with a tranquil pace, an effortless and gliding tread in which, despite my terror and stupefaction, I perceived a certain horrible and feminine grace. I followed the apparition with my eyes as it passed among the monuments without pausing and vanished in the darkness of the pines on the opposite side of the field. No sooner had it gone than a second, also bearing in its arms an infant skeleton, appeared and passed before me in the same direction and with the same abominable and loathsome grace of movement. A horror that was more than horror, a fear that was beyond fear, petrified all my faculties, and I felt as if I were weighted down by some ineluctable and insupportable burden of nightmare. Before me, skeleton after skeleton, each precisely like the last, with the same macabre lightness and ease of motion, each carrying its pitiful infant, emerged from the shadow of the ancient pines and followed where the first had disappeared, intent as on the same cryptic errand. One by one they came, till I had counted 8. Now I knew the origin of the bizarre footprints whose attenuation had disturbed and troubled me. When the 8th skeleton had passed from my sight, my eyes were drawn as by seen, irresistible impulsion to one of the nearer headstones, beside which I was amazed to perceive what I had not noticed before. A freshly opened grave, gaping darkly in the soft soil. Then, at my elbow, I heard a low rattling, and the fingers of a fleshless hand plucked lightly at my sleeve. A skeleton was beside me, differing only from the others through the fact that it bore no infant in its arms. With a lipless and ingratiating leer, it plucked again at my sleeve, as if to draw me towards the open grave, and its teeth clicked as if it were trying to speak. My senses and my brain, a-swirl with vertiginous terror, could endure no more. I seemed to fall, and fall through depths of infinite eddying blackness with the clutching terror of those fingers upon my arm, till consciousness was left behind in my descent. When I came to, Guinevere was holding me by the arm, concern and puzzlement upon her sweet oval face, and I was standing among the boulders of the field appointed for our rendezvous.
"What on earth is the matter with you, Herbert?" she queried anxiously. "Are you ill? You were standing here in a daze when I came, and didn't seem to hear or see me when I spoke to you. And I really thought you were going to faint when I touched your arm."
And once again, our episode comes to an end. Thank you for returning for Classic Horror and Other Stories, Volume 2. Please share, like, and subscribe to the channel. Take care of yourselves out there, and do everything within your power to have sweet dreams.